Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. On behalf of Reverend Joanna D'Agostino, President of the Ripon Area Ministerial Association, and Professor Henrik Schatzinger and myself, Brian Smith, co-directors of the Center for Politics and the People, we welcome you all this evening to this conversation on the importance of civil dialogue in our highly polarized political society. The polarization during the 2016 election campaign has continued in American society. And there have been many cases where family members or friends have lost the ability to speak with one another respectfully, and sometimes have severed some close relationships. In some cases, this loss of respectful conversation among citizens has spilled over into some dangerous behavior. In the last 18 months, there have been attacks and desecrations on mosques and synagogues throughout the country. And incidentally, tonight is the 79th anniversary of Kristallnacht in Germany, when the Nazis began to attack the shops of the Jews and arrest them. Racist language and behavior is rearing its ugly head again in America, including in our own Ripon community and on the college campus, as we heard on a panel on civil rights held in this room 2 weeks ago. This polarization is not merely a political issue, but a moral one. Strong disagreements are healthy for democracy, but close relationships are so important in life that when we damage these by hateful or disrespectful conversation over politics, we are guilty of serious ethical failures. Communal life in our towns and on our campuses is also severely damaged by disrespectful language and behavior over politics. So in such a context, religious leaders do have a responsibility to help citizens realize the negative moral implications of what we are doing, and to assist us in learning how to step back from this kind of damaging language and behavior, tone down our speech, and take steps to heal important broken relationships. For these reasons, the Ripon Area Ministerial Association and the Center for Politics and the People have organized tonight a public discussion on these issues. Our panelists from my right to my left, your left to your right, include Luke Hatfield, who is campus minister with his House Christian Fellowship that works with Ripon College students. Rebecca Fayen, moderator of the Prairie Lakes Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. Reverend Joanna D'Agostino, pastor of First Congregational Church, and the Reverend Kevin Mundell, pastor of Our Savior's United Church of Christ. Now the handouts which we distributed tonight, which I hope you all have, list 4 questions that the panelists will address. Luke Hatfield will address the first question. What in the gospel moves us to speak on the effects of societal polarization on relationships? Becky Fayen will address the second question. What is the harm we are seeing that polarization is causing in our civic communities, faith communities, and families? Pastor Joanna D'Agostino will address the third question. Why and how can we begin to be in conversation with people who strongly disagree with us? And Pastor Kevin Mundell will address the fourth question. What are the misunderstandings that lead us to believe that faith and politics are 2 separate categories in our lives that should not be related? After opening remarks on these questions by the 4 panelists, each one will have a few minutes to describe a personal experience they have had regarding polarizing conversation or behavior. We'll then open it up to conversation with all of you. So let us begin.
All right, well, I want to say thank you to the Center for Politics and the People and to the Ripon Area Ministerial Association for sponsoring this event and for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's truly an honor, and I'm really excited just to have the conversation tonight that we're all hopefully going to be able to have this evening. As I thought about how to answer my question, which is what in the gospel moves us to speak on the effects of societal polarization on relationships, I kind of felt like it broke down into 4 parts, at least as I thought about it. First, what is polarization? Second, what is the gospel? Third, why does the gospel compel me to speak against polarization personally? And fourth, why is this an important topic for all of us, regardless of our religious beliefs? So first, what is polarization? Good old dictionary.com defines polarization as a sharp division as of a population or group into opposing factions. And it's not so much the first part of the definition I have a problem with. As Brian mentioned, strong disagreement. There goes my light. Strong disagreement is healthy in a democracy such as ours. And so in fact, I think part of what we want to strive for when dialoguing about issues about which we disagree is to actually specify and sharpen the distinctions about what we believe and why we believe it. In other words, we want to understand where we agree and where we disagree, and we want to clearly communicate that respectfully with each other. The second half of the definition of polarization is where the problems come in, dividing into opposing factions. Whatever our disagreements may be, and however far apart we may be in our beliefs, I don't believe we should be enemies. And more on that in a minute. So second, what is the gospel? In Romans 1:16-17, God tells us that the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, and that in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. And then God also tells us in 1 Corinthians 15:1-9 that the gospel is that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the scriptures, and then that he appeared after his resurrection to many people. So to kind of put that all together, the gospel is the good news that Jesus Christ died for our sins, rose from the dead, and that by trusting in him as Savior, we can have a right relationship with God now and forever. Third, why does the gospel, the good news about Jesus, compel me personally to speak against polarization? God has many reasons for saving us and many purposes in saving us. In John 3:16, we're given one reason he saves us. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. So God loves us. And then we also know from the Great Commandment, 2 of the purposes for which God saves people is so that we can love him and love others. So love and relationships are 2 of the purposes for which God saved us. And so that's contained in the good news of the gospel about Jesus. And I believe that many of the effects of polarization are not loving and are not helpful to the relationships. And then fourth, why is this important for all of us, regardless of our religious beliefs? Whether you're a Christian here today or not, I hope we can all agree that love and relationships are worth pursuing. And as we will share later on, I think all of us have seen the negative effects that polarization can have on relationships. Furthermore, whether you're a Christian or not, all religions, and I think nearly all human beings, whether they're religious or not, believe in some form of the golden rule, which is do to others what you would want them to do to you. And so the effects of polarization often break this simple rule, which is, I think, crucial for preserving and growing love, decency, and relationships in our world.
Thank you. That's amazing. Are you reading, or I will read? What is the harm we are seeking that polarization is causing our civic communities, faith communities, and families? Well, tonight my quick overview is going to start with the polarizing of individuals, because this is where the polarization starts, with each of us, allowing disappointment, angst, anger, and a myriad of negative feelings to create a barrier between the people who do not share our views. I am personally aware how exhausting it is to interact with people who challenge or fiercely assault our beliefs and vision. When negative emotions and conflict control our actions and we shut other people out, we limit ourselves. We limit our personal growth. We keep ourselves stuck in a small worldview. We become less socially flexible, and that rigidity reduces our ability to be creative. It is our human creativity that pushes society forward by developing supportive relationships. When the conflict and polarization moves into our family, or family equivalent, I love my family equivalent, by the way, interactions can be especially frustrating and volatile. For the good or bad, we are entwined with our families. They are our history and a constant that we should be able to count on. So it is especially heartbreaking when we cannot respect each other enough to have compassionate or at least civil conversations with our relatives. Often it is the innocent bystanders that are hurt the most when families become polarized. Think of how kids benefit from loving, supportive interactions and just want to have fun with their extended family. Or the grandma who longs for a cohesive relationship amongst her children and grandchildren. It is easy to become hardened and damage familiar relationships, which should be a safety net in these turbulent times. If the polarization extends into our civic and religious communities, its effectiveness of the group suffers. I'm not talking about conflict, because conflict, when handled properly, can benefit an organization, propelling it to make constructive changes. Polarization paralyzes progress. That I want to put on a t-shirt. And it limits the good works that can be accomplished by the group. Unfortunately, community situations that need our help are often the issues most politicized and divisive. I also want to assert that polarization is creating a predicament for ministers, especially when social issues are often viewed as political positions. Instead of challenging the congregations, ministers are often trying to calm the church, keep it in cohesiveness. It is the responsibility of ministers to help their congregation explore social issues through the religious teachings. A 2014 article in the National Catholic Reporter titled, so this is all the way back to 2014, Fighting Polarization Within the Church by Michael Sean Winters, and he states, there is a rich diversity within the church tradition that will allow those who treat it like a service station, seeking only proof texts for their previously arrived at position, to empty the richness in pursuit of an ideological agenda. How much more interesting our theological conversations would be if we treated the tradition as a rich source of wisdom that it is. How much more honest our conversations would be if we did not cherry pick from the tradition, highlight only those parts with which we agree, and just so, decline to be challenged by the parts that trouble us. Then Mr. Winters continues with, the church is not beholden to an ideology because it does not worship an idea. And that's the end of his quote. So after a service, we should be walking out of our church with at least something to think about, possibly a new perspective, and sometimes a little or a lot of upset. So no pressure to you ministers. Okay? The impact of polarization escalates as it moves to the greater community. Here it is easy to demonize the other. Those other people should be ridiculed, stripped of power, silenced, punished, and perhaps even destroyed. Demonizing the other's position leaves little room for compromise, collaboration, or mutual understanding. Polarization is an obstacle to developing, supporting, carefully thought through solutions to the pressing social problems in our community, our country, and our world.
Thank you. All right, so my question is why and how can we be in conversation with people who strongly disagree with us? And I'll do them one at a time, why and then how. There's the quote that's often attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt that's great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, small minds discuss people. And I don't know about you, but I want to be a great mind, right? And if we discuss ideas with other people, then there is no doubt in the world that we're going to disagree frequently about our ideas. That's how it goes, right? We disagree about our ideas. And somewhere along the line, we decided that a disagreement was a personal attack. It was a negative thing. Rather than seeing a disagreement as a way of sharpening our own understanding of our ideas. We used to have that saying, well, maybe you still do have the saying in your family, don't talk about politics or religion at the dinner table. And that's not a saying I ever agreed with. That's not a saying I was raised with. It's not a saying that I'm raising my children with. But I think that it's gotten bigger now. It's so much more. It's don't talk about taxes or welfare or minimum wage or immigration or recycling. It's don't talk about the education system or climate change or law enforcement or healthcare. It's don't talk about sexuality or abortion or race or addiction. It's don't talk about prisons or patriotism or the military or dog ownership. All of it will be politicized, right? And this is the thing, yes, of course it will be politicized because we are citizens of a democracy and the word politics means the affairs of the city, the affairs of the place in which we live. Politics are the way we function within our community and this world. And we have the absolute honor and freedom in this nation to discuss and to be educated about our laws and our leaders. We have the honor and the freedom to disagree, to stand within our perspective, to sharpen our understandings of our ideas. So somewhere along the line, we decided that disagreement on politics and religion is grounds for severing a relationship. And in order to avoid disagreement so that we can maintain our relationships, we spend our dinners walking on eggshells, narrowing our conversations, and narrowing our minds. But what if disagreement is not grounds for severing a relationship? What if we lower the stakes again? What if disagreement is grounds instead for the productive development of our ideas? So how can we be in conversation with those who we strongly disagree with? I think we'll dive into that more, but the most important thing, I believe, is that we cannot go into our conversations with the intention of changing the other person's mind. That isn't the purpose of dialogue, and it never was. It never was. And the other way around, we cannot go into a conversation with an unwillingness for our own mind to be changed. That we have to be willing to see our own mind change, even about the things we never thought we'd change our minds on. The purpose of conversation is to tell our truth about how we're feeling and why, and to listen to somebody else tell their truth about how they're feeling and why. So that by understanding one another's thought process, we can see the differences and the commonalities of our humanity. I also think it's extremely important to realize that disagreement is not a personal attack. So debate does not need to be so emotionally fueled. And if we know that we're going to have a discussion with someone that we're probably going to disagree with, then it's important for us to make sure that we are going into that conversation in a place, in a sturdy enough emotional place to practice self-differentiation. So that is taking ourselves out of the emotions of the talk. That's me.
I'm the keeper of the mics that have dead batteries.
If anybody has any AA batteries.
We got 4 mics. They're screaming out for some AA batteries. So my question is, what are the misunderstandings that lead us to believe that faith and politics are 2 separate categories in our lives that should not be related? And there's a lot of avenues I could go with this. 4 things, really, maybe 5, really stick in my head that I'm thinking through and processing as I struggle with this question. The first is understanding that when we set up separation of church and state, it was simply set up to be that we didn't want the state to prop up the church and the church to prop up the state. But the understanding is that the church, and not just the church, but other religions would lend viable, important, helpful pieces of data for a collective group of people to figure out how to govern themselves and to try and struggle with what is right and wrong in an ongoing situation or relationship. In the early 80s, Supreme Court started changing rulings, and what the rulings became is that anyone in a public position with any kind of authority should not mention religion in any positive light or at all. And so we went into a period where we kind of just said, you can't talk about religion in a public space, which was not separation of church and state, but how it started to get interpreted. So then it became the question of then how do you discuss morality? What do you base it on? Where do you go with it? And we developed a pattern, and you can see it in culture too. You had shows in the 50s and 60s like Andy Griffith's show where so many episodes had them going to church. The episode happened in the church, or they were talking about church because they just got home from it, and all of a sudden all TV shows had no mention of religion of any kind. And movies had no mention of religion of any kind. And schools, when I was in public school, they couldn't mention it. Now you can talk about it as long as you talk about more than one and name it. But for a while, you were not even allowed to talk it. That created sort of a framework that limited conversation or the place and role of the church. That's one strand that I'm thinking through on this. A second strand that I'm thinking through on this would be, I think we've taken and reduced politics to a space, as if politics is a space, economics is a space, social things is a space, religious things is a space that sort of undercuts our humanity and oversimplifies it and takes away the complexity of who we are. And not only have we shrunk it to a space, but with it we've said politics has to be something rational. So in the space, you're supposed to throw out rational ideas, and the best idea should stick, and then everybody should rationally see it, and then we all move forward with the same idea. That assumes that all of us think rationally and do it all the time, and that none of us are driven by passions or love or creativity or just something that makes us more than being a thinking theism on a stick. As a scholar, I like quotes all the time. And so we've limited our political thinking to being, it's got to be rational and in a very narrow space. And I think that's hindered us, hindered our conversations, has helped create the climate of polarization because we haven't been able to have bigger conversations, and we've lost sight of the complexity of what it means to be human. A third thing that runs through my head on this is civic religion was an idea that came from Rousseau, a French philosopher who felt it was necessary for a democracy, and what the civic religion did is it sort of gave a holiness or a sacredness or a legitimacy to a political system, a democratic political system. And in our country, we've always had a civic religion, and what we tended to do was to see Christianity as the primary civic religion with some ties to Judaism. When we hit World War II and had lots of people exposed to the world in a level in which we had never experienced before, I think our civic religion split in two. And how it split was it became a sort of Christian liberal and a Christian conservative civic religion, that what then started to happen is if someone came forth from the conservative side of the church with an idea that was political, the media would grab the counterpoint from the other side, so that all of a sudden, every time one side was put up, the other voice was put up as the opposite from the church, which made the church look like, well, they completely disagree, so how can they speak to anything? And so we created this ongoing dialogue where whenever a left or a right view of the church was put up publicly, the opposite was put up from the church, which made the church just look irrelevant. And then what I think happened is that negating voice, after a while, we developed a new civic religion, and what we took on as our civic religion is we decided that as long as we were becoming more efficient, as long as we were progressing, as long as our technology was progressing, then all is good. And we shifted from having a religious sense to one about we just need to be moving forward and always progressing and always going, which negated legitimate voices of religion within our culture. And then the fourth piece that I think has been really haunting us is our technological change is so fast and is happening to the point where I don't know that we just know how to deal with it, we don't know how to comprehend it, we don't know how to come to grips with it, and we're afraid. And it's easier to use something like polarization as a means to hide our fear. I can take a side and yell and scream. And then I don't have to look inward and say, look, this world is moving extremely fast, and what's happening is beyond my comprehension. I mean, I preached at the baccalaureate this past spring, and I said, here's the reality. You're entering a world where the accumulated human knowledge is doubling every 12 months and is on its way to every 11 months. Okay? My youngest entered college this year. That means when he graduates, it will have doubled 4 times. How do we sort through it? How do we figure out what's good information, what's bad information? This affects our politicking, this affects our polarization. I mean, we've had the controversy of Google and Yahoo and those websites that have simply tried to help us get at the information the best we can, and inadvertently polarized us, because if you look for an idea with a specific slant, then everything was leaning that same slant, and you wouldn't, Google was not saying, well, here's a conservative idea, and a liberal idea, and a moderate idea. They would give you what they thought you wanted, without asking, And our technology is overwhelming us, and we don't know how to sort through it, we don't know how to bring it into the conversation of where does our faith come into this, because everything we do is a political action. And I think maybe a fifth thing at the deepest level is, and it's part of the change, we're on a precipice for humanity of being at a point where our technology is close to overrunning us. I mean, we're real close to not needing people to do much work anymore. And one of the hot topics is artificial intelligence. That raises the question of what is our purpose or point as humans, and that scares us. And sometimes I think these deep fears with things we don't struggle with or name comes out with us polarizing as a distraction. That sometimes what we do in our polarization is our way of hiding from stuff and questions we don't want to ask. What's the future of my grandkid or great-grandkid in a world where technology says they really don't need to work? How are they going to feed themselves? Because the world I know is disappearing on me. So I think these are just some of the strands of thoughts that I've been processing in relation to this question as we struggle with how do we deal with polarization.
Thank you, all of you. Now, we'll give each of you 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Tell us a story where you've had personal experience with this polarization, and what did you do about it, or the person that you're telling us about what happened. Let's start with Luke.
All right, well, my story is a bit of a public confession. I have a wonderful family on both sides, and I love my mother-in-law very dearly, but we disagree politically. And so we've had some very good conversations about that, but one specific time that I needed to learn a lesson, and that she was gracious enough to teach me that lesson, is we were talking a little bit about the protests that are happening during the national anthem in the NFL. And so obviously a very political hot topic, and lots has been said, plenty of ink has been spilled. And she remarked something about that there was a rule in the NFL that they had to stand for the pledge. And just fact is, there is a policy, but it's not enforced. So what's the difference between a policy and a rule? Whatever. I didn't even realize that, although I had been trying to keep up with kind of the debate and stuff. And so I said, I just kind of meanly and really uncaringly, unthinkingly, I was frustrated, and I just said, "Where'd you get that, Fox News?" and it was cruel. It was uncaring, and it was a dig I knew would hurt. And And thankfully, later on, she loved me enough to come and say, that really hurt me. And I had to say, I'm sorry, you're right, I shouldn't have said that. Like that wasn't moving any kind of dialogue forward, that wasn't accomplishing anything except hurting her. And what was I proving? What was I showing myself to be? And it was just so arrogant. And I don't want to be that kind of a person. And so thankfully she forgave me, and I hope that I learned a lesson. So.
I have two stories, but they're situations. But the first one is very quick, and it deals with, yes, I'm that person that unfriended my father on Facebook. And I know I could have unfollowed him. I do, but I was making a point. And he really didn't care, and it was fine. And to my benefit, Facebook also dropped him at one point. So he had to set up a new Facebook account. I think I was right. And anyways, and so he sent me a friend request, and I accepted. And now my dad mostly posts photos of his food when he eats out, so we are good. And but my real concern is, this is my real story that hurts. My partner of many, many years has never, ever, ever voted before. Well, until his last presidential election. And of course, he voted for the candidate I did not support. So my feelings are very hurt and very raw. I'm struggling with the conversations around me because his forever friend has been against my political standings for years and has always tried his darndest to raise my ire. And it works really well a lot of times. But normally I just kind of back down and whatever. But now it's the both of them, ranting about the government because the changes are not happening fast enough, and vociferously stating what should happen to those who don't agree with the president. Well, this did not bring out my better angel by any means. And so I found myself, and several times, making ridiculous and cruel statements in opposition just for the conversation to stop. And then my partner told me that his friend no longer wanted to come over and visit when I was at the house. And this is not my house, it's his house. It's my partner's house. We don't live together. And, so I'm like, well, my enlightened, thoughtful response was, good. Then I don't have to listen to his beep radio edit, because I really didn't say nice words. And that certainly was not the response my partner expected or wanted from me. I know that I normally treat people much better, and I should have. I do see this friend, and we are kind to each other. We still are. I made the decision that I would not respond to the political rhetoric. This is my attempt to maintain peace and my integrity. But since I've been reading and preparing for this discussion, I've decided that this friend and I need to have a constructive and hopefully compassionate conversation. I'd hoped to complete that before today, but it didn't happen. And I am planning to give him some of the materials I have read, and then also a list of issues that I would love us to discuss, and he can respond with however and add more issues if he'd like to, whatever. And if all goes well with this conversation, I'm going to consider approaching my partner, but I'm not ready for that yet.
All right, so recently I met someone in the church while waiting for an event to begin. And this was someone I hadn't met before, and I'll probably never see him again. He wasn't from the area. I introduced myself as the pastor to him, which as always is kind of like a big surprise, and wow, that's exciting. So, really? Okay, and we began a conversation about church and ministry and what called me to ministry and what my church was about and what size we were and those kind of general, typical, harmless topics. And we had a really nice conversation. I really enjoyed talking to this guy. We had a good rapport, we were enjoying our time together, and then he asked me if there was something in particular that I was passionate about in my ministry. And so I told him my truth. My truth is that I have an active and growing passion for prison ministry. It's something that's really important to me. And he immediately responded, "Oh, that's not something I support." And I was so confused because I was discouraged, and I wasn't discouraged by his lack of support. I don't need his support for my prison ministry. I have enough integrity to know that it's something that I should be doing, that I believe I should be doing. But how quickly he jumped up to shut the door on something that he didn't know anything about. He knew nothing about what type of work I do, about the theology behind it, about my political opinions, about what it was that brought me to that work. He had no idea about my relationship with law enforcement, with the corrections officers, with judges and lawyers, and all of this that is around it. He simply established that he didn't support it. And his this unwillingness to see a different perspective is something that I see so often from all political ideologies. We're constantly walking on eggshells for fear of saying something that could evolve into a political argument. And you see, in some ways, I was really upset at him for saying that's not something I support, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought how often we think that, but don't say it out loud. So the moment you say to me, like, I have a ministry to the military, and something, and I'm not saying this is something I feel, but that in my mind I'm triggered, that's not something I support. Or, you say you have a ministry to the LGBT community, and in my mind I'm saying that's not something I support. And neither of those are true for me. But that we often jump to a conclusion of not supporting something before we're even willing to hear the facts about it. That's just an example of something that happened to me recently.
So I'll tell a slightly different story. I was part of a church a while back, and one of the things that happened with our denominations, we have a synod, and our synod is non-hierarchical, but most people don't get that. So we have, and the UCC is this broad umbrella denomination. And I was in a church that was probably, I would say, politically half Republican, half Democratic, and didn't know it. So they didn't know the makeup. They all assumed everybody in the church was like that. They didn't realize that they were probably 50-50 divided. And our synod had a resolution come forward, and what the resolution was is it was calling churches to take serious the issue of gay marriage, to prayerfully and humbly get out Scripture and struggle with Scripture and look at this issue and talk about it and pray and discern and really wrestle with it. The media heard it and said, first denomination to come out pro-gay marriage, which was not what the resolution was, but it set people off all over our conference, all over the nation. Well, there's this synod within the UCC, and the bishop for that synod wrote a letter and listed off all of these, sinful, and you need to stop as a church giving any of your mission money to the denomination as missions because all their money is going to support gay marriage. And sent it to the presidents of each congregation by routing the ministers. Didn't send it to the ministers. So the president of my congregation and our council gets this and brings it up, ready to axe all funding to the denomination because all our funding is going to that, which created this incredible tension in the council meeting. And so what I did is I took everything that the bishop said and said, okay, this is one way to interpret this. Here's 2 or 3 others. Here's one way to look at this. Went through the funding and said, if you're going to make the argument that the funding of our missions is supporting this idea, it at best is 0.5%. So why are you cutting all of it for 0.5%? And just lay the stuff out. And the really sad moment was when we came back together and realized that they couldn't even discuss it further because they couldn't think theologically, couldn't think about their faith in conversation. And that was the moment where I realized that that church did not have the ability to move forward. And what happened is the 2 most vocal people on opposite sides just quietly walked away from the church because they didn't have the capacity to even have the conversation, to even bring their faith into the dialogue, or to even struggle with how do we work through any of this stuff. And it was just a powerful, disturbing, sad, but telling moment at an organizational or system level.
On that unhappy note, now we'll open it up to you. What I'd ask you to do is to identify who you are, if you would. If not, that's fine. And I will repeat your question so that the sound system can pick it up. And then if you wanted to direct your question to one of the panelists, do so. Or if it's a question just for any of them, do so. So let's start. Who wants to ask the first question? Yes.
Hey, I'm Eric, I'm a sophomore. Would you say that extremism and polarization are mutual or not?
The question from Eric, the sophomore, is, are extremism and polarization the same? Is that the question?
Mutual or not?
Mutual or not?
Are you asking anyone in particular?
Just anyone, whoever wants to answer it.
I personally don't think they're the same thing. You can have polarization. I think there's something more going on with how extreme things get. And I don't know that we know enough. You know, there's research coming out of England that says that going to a certain level of extremity may actually be a psychological shift in what's going on in the brain. We don't know enough. We're at the beginning of trying to figure this stuff out. I mean, one of the most complex things we have is a human brain, and we don't know how it works.
Well, did you want to? Sure. Yeah.
And I would probably echo what Kevin said, that I don't think you can say that they're exactly the same thing, but I do think that a lot of times the language of extremism in certain cases tends to polarization, right? So a lot of times extremists of any bent demonize and make enemies of the other side. And that is what I feel is polarization. When you make an enemy of a person who disagrees with you. And now I'm going to not just disagree with you, I'm going to fight against you. And so I think that's what's damaging to relationships and to our society, when we make an enemy of someone else. And so if extremism is doing that, then I think that's the case. But if it's just I have a very extreme view on something, as long as I can hold that view without making enemies of anyone who disagrees with me, I think then you're avoiding polarization, I guess, if that makes sense.
Great question.
Extremists have made great contributions to history. And they do not necessarily believe in polarization. If polarization occurs, it's not because they want it. I think the Buddha, you think of Moses, you think of Jesus, as we're talking about religions, and they were extremists. But they weren't polarizing by intent, and they treated people gently, even their enemies. So I would say they are different. Next question. Yes, Eric.
Also Eric, but this time a retired Ripon College faculty member. We're going to put you four on the spot. You've made the case that polarization is an important moral issue. You're all supposed to be moral leaders as clergy. And so I'd like to ask, there are several parts to this. Have you ever preached on the subject of polarization in your role as a moral leader in your church? And have you ever led by example? That is, for each of the four stories, one can quickly think of what you should have done. For example, you could, Reverend D'Agostino could have said, why are you opposed to that? And that would have furthered the discussion. So two parts. Have you preached on it, and what can you do to lead people forward?
Okay. For the sake of the technology, two parts of the question. Since this is a moral issue, have any of you given sermons on the issue of polarization as a moral issue? And secondly, what have you done in some of these situations? You left us kind of hanging in some of the stories. How have you handled some of these stories or brought them to some sort of resolution?
I will start with, on the preaching, especially during the election, one of the things I challenge my people to is, I don't have a problem with people disagreeing, because growth comes from conflict. All growth comes from conflict. My issue is, and what I preach is you better see the face of God in the person you're disagreeing with and never lose sight of it. And there's a big difference there. You know, you need to see that person as a person and never lose sight of their humanity. But I don't have a problem if you disagree, because our growth comes from conflict. It's how we handle and manage the conflict that allows it to be growth or turns into something negative for us. To my specific story, I tried to create a climate where we could have the discussion, and we were at least able to do discussions on it in our adult ed class, but we never got to the place where the congregation as a whole could go forward with it, for many different reasons. But it was still an incredible learning point, and for the congregation to realize, there's more tension and divide than we realize, what I think was eye-opening in some ways.
All right, this is funny for me because like there's a lot of people in my congregation who are here. Yeah, I would say, I hope that I preach on polarization quite frequently because I think it's a really important moral topic of the day. I preach on it sometimes and I get myself in trouble, and I preach on it sometimes and I think start really productive conversations. I will probably not know for 10 years whether, I've made any change in that way or not. But I'd say for me, like Luke earlier defined the gospel, which is certainly a definition I agree with, but I also will say that for me, a huge part of the gospel is the South African concept of Ubuntu. I am because you are. I am a human through other humans. My humanity is bound up in your humanity. And so often I preach on that if we are, if our relationship is broken, if our understanding of each other is severed, then we are not living into the wholeness to which Christ calls us. So for me, polarization is a brokenness in that concept of Ubuntu. If I'm not seeing the humanity in you, then I'm breaking my commitment to the gospel. If I'm not seeing Jesus Christ in you, you said that, then I'm breaking my commitment to the gospel. So that's something I preach on, I'd say, all the time. In my story, I did push back on him. I said, what is it that you don't agree with? We talked about it a little bit. It was kind of funny because we happened to be standing in the hallway of our church, and I don't know, maybe a lot of you don't even know this, but in the kind of book, there's a book nook in our church, and there's a big purple painting of a landscape with it's beautiful, and it was painted by one of the inmates at Fox Lake Correctional Institution where I do my ministry. And so we were standing right in front of that painting, and I said, it's interesting, standing right in front of a painting that was created in prison by one of these beautiful humans that I work with, and then he quickly shifted the conversation to how he has a friend who knows how to paint. So.
Okay, I am not a minister, and our church is lay-led. One of the things I'm going to talk about as far as polarization, because we are a quite liberal group, and we pretty much agree with each other. Don't get me wrong, we have our conflicts on many issues. But one thing I've been really striving and pushing from the beginning is that we control our language around the other. It's easy for us to get caught up. We all are fairly like-minded people with very different interpretations of everything. And my point has always been that I hear a lot of negativity and a lot of horrible things throughout the week. Sunday when I come to service, I don't want to hear about it. And unfortunately, our organization loves that kind of conversation. So we then divided up our Sundays. You keep working through this stuff. We have second and fourth Sunday, our service Sundays that are very much spiritually oriented. And then our first and third Sundays are what we call an engaged Sunday, which are more social justice, where we have a little bit more freedom to be the people who we are. But since doing this exercise here, I have decided that we're going to maybe challenge the conversation a little bit more, play the opposite role. I do this in my personal life, which gets me in a lot of trouble, so I kind of don't want to get everybody riled up at church, but it might be happening a little bit. Okay, you believe that, you say that, but now think about what the other person is going to be saying. I think there's going to be a little bit more of that happening for us, so we'll see what happens. We talk a lot to begin with, so it's going to be interesting.
I really appreciate this question, and I think it's a really important one. I also am not a pastor of a congregation right now, but I do have regular opportunities to teach. I'll actually be teaching later tonight about David at our Campus Christian Fellowship meeting, and so I do have opportunities to teach and preach. One of the things that is essential for me personally is to preach and teach from God's Word, from the Bible. And so I try to preach whatever the passage is in front of me. And so I guess one of the things that I would say that I've learned over my time as a preacher and a teacher is to nuance better than I did when I was younger. and to be more careful, even in how I express truths. And recognizing that there's all sorts of situations that I am not aware of that are going on. And so I think that's probably the biggest way as far as in my preaching and teaching. As far as leading by example, Joanna and I at the meeting the other night, she said we're Facebook warriors.
We're keyboard warriors.
Keyboard warriors, yes. And so one of the ways that I actually really enjoy is trying to take Facebook, which is so often a medium for polarization, and make it a medium for dialogue and constructive dialogue. And I do that in a lot of ways. One is by posting just thought-provoking articles from all different perspectives, not just mine, although a lot of times they are ones that make me think and that I appreciate, but then saying, what are your thoughts? And then trying to kind of almost be a moderator in the discussion. And I'll sometimes even on the thread praise people and say, thanks for such a respectful dialogue, guys. Like, let's keep it going. And sometimes I even keep conversations going that other people have even said, I don't know why you're still talking with that person. And I say, because we may never agree, but there are other people who are looking at the conversation and can see that we can respectfully talk to each other even when we're disagreeing. And I always feel like I have something to learn. And so those are some of the ways, I guess, that I try to lead by example. So yeah, thank you again for the question.
Thank you. Judy?
Yes, my name is Judy Harris, and my question is to everyone up here, and for all of us to think about a little bit. You were talking, Kevin, about technology and how that has changed, and I was thinking at the time of when Vietnam was televised, the body count every night was listed, and this was a whole different way of looking and thinking about war that most of us had not been exposed to. And now it seems to me that the technology allows us to see so much more of the world, to see how people that we don't have daily contact with, what their lives are every day. And so we're exposed to new religions, we're exposed to new ideas. Sometimes that results in a lot of fear and anxiety about what we believe, whether it's a moral issue or how do you see that as affecting the polarization? Or do you think it does not?
So the question is, with the advances of technology, we can find out instantaneously what's going on in the world. And we can learn a lot about differences, ideas, cultures, religions, but sometimes that causes fear. So how do we deal with that? And what do you say to someone? You know, I think some of you touched upon this issue of fear. Kevin, you raised it before. And people just shut down when they get afraid. So does this technology that ironically opens our minds to the world also shuts us down emotionally so that we become very fearful and then polarized?
I'll answer it.
The technology has really gotten complex in that, for example, if you just go to Google and search the word God, and the 10,000 websites, each telling a different story. The technology has raised questions for us on truth. How do we know what's true? There's too much information. How do we get our head around it? What I think the technology is doing is not it's a tool. It's not intentionally trying to polarize us as much as the tool has shown us how big, how complex, how scary the world can be, but it's also a tool without filters. So let me illustrate that in a weird way. 1st of October, we had 58 people killed in Las Vegas, okay? We murder in the US 33 people a day, on average. That's not much more than 33. By the end of October, we had murdered over 1,000 people in the United States. Now, we allow 68 suicides per day in the US, and we have 102 people who die by car accident per day in the US. But we don't get perspective on this stuff. Our population is over 300 million. So you take everyone who's killed in a car accident, everyone who dies by suicide, everyone who is murdered in a year in the US, and you still can't even come close to 0.5%. So the technology is giving us tons of information without filter. And we're just starting the conversations on how do we filter? What's good information? What's bad information? You know? How do we weed through all this? And I think what it does is, it's not that it leads us to polarization, but it numbs us. It scares us, and we shut down. And then I think a lot of times what happens is, out of the shutting down, we polarize, because it's easier. Sometimes it feels safer. I can get a better grip on things if I just put up a wall against someone, because I can't handle all it's information overload. And I think that's what it does more than anything. But it's still, I mean, we've got some amazing technological tools at our disposal. But there's just so much stuff, so much information.
On the positive side, I know there's a lot of fear, but there's a lot of resolve with learning about other people. And that is one thing technology has really helped. It's wonderful to be able to go on the internet and read about something, or watch on television amazing programs that tell you about other people and the complexity of what's going on in their worlds. It is very scary. I even think of one of my favorite people to watch is Anthony Bourdain, when he's going around and talking about the cultures. And he points out the good and the bad, and how everything's just a delicate little balance. And we do have to take what we read off the internet with a grain of salt to some respect. But yet, there's so much to look at the humanity that is out there, and how different people look, but how much they still are the same and like us. They want their families to be safe and healthy, and it's the same things that we want. They have a religion that has good and bad to it. Most of our religions historically have had good and bad also. Fortunately, we're in a time period where we are much higher, dealing with things on a better level than, when Christianity first started out, or I know Islam is in a terrible situation back and forth right now, but there are so many good people out there as well. And that's where you can learn about that. Maybe that's the point, is to kind of look to the good, what's out there on the internet versus what's negatively happening.
Yeah, I guess I just want to say that for me, I'm in maybe somewhat of a unique position to answer your question, because I'm a millennial. So for me, the internet is not there's no fear. I think it's great. I think everything about it I think is great. I think the doors it opens for us to understand humanity. I think our understanding the doors that are opening to understanding cultures are amazing. I love being able to show my kids, here's what people living in this country are like. Like, here's a story of a different religion. That stuff is amazing to me. So I do think that it is driving fear for a lot of people for whom it is changing so quickly that they can't understand it. But I think, I've been basically raised with it. And so for me, I see it as so positive. So.
I think that your question definitely does hit on kind of that fear, and something that has been important for me to learn is that anger is usually a secondary emotion, And so there's usually when people are angry, usually there's something underneath that, and I think you hit on one of them, fear or hurt, right? And so then we get angry, and so I thought what Kevin said about it being a defense mechanism was a great point. 2 filters, I guess, that I would suggest, just filters, because he said we have technology without filters. Okay, so we need to provide the filters, right? So how do we do that? Number 1, I think community. And for me, that's the church. That's one of my primary places of community, and my family. All right, and so I need to have them as a filter. My wife has helped me on numerous occasions be like, don't post that. or I see the discussion getting a little heated there, and she's really helped me by reading my posts. And so allowing other people to hold us accountable is one filter. So the people around you. Another filter would be, if you're feeling overwhelmed, get off of technology for a while. Go find someone to talk with face-to-face in a coffee shop, right? People are just as fascinating here as they are anywhere else in the world. Like, we're all people, and we're all made in God's image, and we're all valuable. And so just enjoy time with somebody else. If you're getting overwhelmed, be your own filter and turn it off for a while.
Or watch cat videos.
Or cat videos, yes, thank you.
Monkeys.
Cat videos. Yes, in the back, please. Ray.
Yes. A year ago, I had the chance to hear the president of the United Church of Christ speak about research he has done on white privilege. And he has created a study series for United Church of Christ churches. When I heard him describe the content of that material, which I believe is designed to help break down barriers to understanding between power structures in our culture, I got to thinking, this will never fly in Ripon. I would like to ask the 2 United Church of Christ ministers if you've offered that particular course yet. If not, why not? Sorry to be so aggressive.
Okay, the question is that the president of the United Church of Christ has done research on white privilege and apparently has put out some information or suggestions on how churches should deal with this. And Ray wants to know from the 2 UCC ministers, have you read this and included it in your preaching or in your adult education?
I have downloaded it and I have brought it up. The hurdle I am facing is not understanding what the concept of white privilege even is, that why would we want to even talk about it? So that's part of it, and part of that comes from, born and raised in Ripon and have never left Ripon and not really paying attention to everything that's going on always in the world around them. But I have brought it up to different people and at least started conversations with people about the idea and how does this play into things? But that's looking at yourself and the advantages you have and being critical of them is not an easy thing to do on any subject.
Okay. I feel super awkward answering this question, to be completely honest, but I'm really glad you answered it right. This has been a pretty hot topic right now in our congregation. So I do know of the curriculum. I've read the curriculum. I think it's wonderful. I've seen it reviewed by people. I think it's incredible work. I think the name is so off-putting that I don't think it's going to fly in a lot of the UCC churches, not just in Ripon, but across the country. So that's part of what's upsetting for me is the content of the curriculum is incredible. The name is going to shut people down right away. And there's this huge part of me that wants to say, get over it. Drop your, stop being so defensive and just move on and be willing to open your minds and hear it. But then there's the part of me that knows that we have to be gentle about these things that, like Kevin said, it doesn't make sense to bring into certain towns this concept of white privilege when to a lot of people, it doesn't make any sense. It's not they say like how am I privileged? You know, I'm still living paycheck to paycheck. Don't tell me I'm privileged, you know? And so a couple weeks ago, we had a preacher come to preach at our church, Tracy Robertson, and she is the executive director of Fit Oshkosh. It's a racial equity 501c3 in Oshkosh, and she spoke to this, and she helped tried to the intention was for us to listen to her speak about what it is to be a black woman in this part of the country, and people. I'd say, like, for the most part, and this is where I'm super awkward talking about this, for the most part, most people were very glad to listen to her, even if they didn't agree with her. You know, there were some people who said, like, I was so interested to open my ears and open my mind to hear what she had to say. But there were people who said, no, I'm not gonna go there. I don't wanna have this conversation. I'm not ready right now. And I struggle with this because there's a part of me that gets angry and says, take a stand. Stand up. Racism is real in this country, and it is real in this state even more. We just got research that came out that said that this is the most difficult state to be a black boy. Okay, the chances of going to prison if you're born in 1990 are 1 in 3 if you're black in this state. And so there's that part of me that says, like, get over the title, like, let it go and move on and just talk about this because this is a problem. And then there's the part of me that says, but we're gonna lose the people who are most important. The people that we need to hear this the most will not hear it because of that word. All right? So that's my answer.
Over here? Rose?
You actually answered my question.
Okay.
That was
Okay. We have time for a few more questions. In the back? In the back.
I was born in 1950. I'm a little, more than a little, sort of disconcerted by the totally abstract nature of this conversation. Because I can remember very well, like when Richard Nixon and John Kennedy had an election and one of them lost, people didn't immediately assume the world was going to end because their person lost or won. And my sense is, though, that in spite of how we talk about these things, in the past there was a much greater general agreement, whether you were a religious person or not, whether you went to church or not, about what was good, of what was right, and what was wrong. And a lot of these things didn't even get talked about because everybody just assumed that, well, homosexuality is wrong. You didn't even talk about it. And I also operate from the position that if everybody was totally open and creative, dinner would never get made. So now we have all of these things that come along, and I think I'm a pretty open person, but I must admit, I think I have a hard time dealing with some of this stuff. I mean, it used to be if you were supposed to go to work and do what the boss told you, and okay, maybe you would become a millionaire, but you would always have a job. That's not true anymore. If you went to buy something, it was made by somebody that looked like you and maybe didn't live too far away from you either. And I guess my point is, I think there was less polarization because there was much more general agreement about what was right and what was wrong. And, you know, people would debate about whether you were a Trinitarian or not, but we didn't really think that was important anyway. So I don't know where this goes, and I guess I'm not really expressing a question, but I can understand people like my father, who died 20 years ago, were the way they were, why they thought what they thought. It was just different.
The comment, if I can try to summarize it, is that 50 years ago there was much more of a consensus in our society. Even when your candidate lost, you respected the other side. And there was a consensus on right and wrong. And what the gentleman is raising is that that's all up for grabs now. So there doesn't seem to be any consensus or common ground on what our values are, what is right or what is wrong. And so everybody has kind of their own silo and they're going in different directions, and this stimulates polarization.
And that's part of the technological question too. That as we've been, and before the technology, World War II got us ships and planes that could connect people, but it also took Americans that were living on an island of this continent and put them in multi-cultures all over the world and exposed people to a level that had never before been experienced. That decade, 1940 to 1950, is a decade of incredible change. We lost 1/3 of the farmers in that decade. You had a whole ton of people go to World War II and say, if I live through this, I'm getting off the farm. And they moved to suburbs and formed the suburbs, and that was the end of that's when we started getting rid of the one-room schoolroom, and all those breakdowns and shifts happened then. We had a transcontinental cable that allowed us to interact at a significantly higher level. And so that decade is when we completely opened up our understanding of things, because we had people went all over the world and encountered contradictory things, brought the ideas back. And all of a sudden, our world, which was a sheltered world, blew open because we experienced multiculturalism at a level we had never experienced before. We didn't just send people to Germany. We sent people to Africa. We sent people to all of Europe. We sent people to Asia, all different countries, and experiencing different cultures, and coming back with fresh data and fresh ideas at a level we never encountered before, with contradictory moral values. And that's the beginning of where we really start exploding in our moral, where it opens up. In some ways, I would argue we have too many morals, and don't know how to tie together a unified sense of morality. And at times, we have people with completely contradictory morals. So that decade, 40 to 50, that you were born into, or right after, was a turning point in many ways. The technology has amped this up to an even higher level. Because now, I mean, my kids will sit on video games with people all over the world. And you can interact with cultures at an incredible, profound level that never existed before, no matter how small the country is. And we're hitting ideas at levels we've never experienced before, just all kinds of stuff. And it's, part of it is, the world isn't simple. We thought it was because we had walls that kept it simple. Well, those walls are gone. Now we have a different conversation. How do we be Christian in a world with extreme complexity?
All right, so this might be a little bit inflammatory, but I just would ask the question, do you think that it's possible that the agreement 50 years ago was based on standing on the necks of the oppressed? You know, so if we think about the voices that were oppressed 40 to 50 years ago that did not get to speak up, that did not have a word, now they have a word. And yeah, they might be causing us conflict because they're bringing us to think about things in a different way. So I would say that maybe it looked like we had more agreement that long ago, but there were a whole lot of voices that didn't get to speak. Yeah.
That's very similar to what I was going to state, because people have not changed that much. We honestly have not. These things have been going on throughout history. And I understand some of your angst. I hired a young guy to help me at work as my assistant. But then I tried to remember, I remember being 20 and I wasn't that good either as a worker. But I was thinking, who is the fool here? You know, I thought, he's so irresponsible, he's this, he's that, whatever. And I'm thinking, who's the idiot that's at work for 10 plus hours a day, sometimes? Me. And as he runs out, if I give him a second to leave early, he's out the door faster than anything else. And I'm like, maybe the world we had created before wasn't the world as it should be, you know? We have to think about that. I know it's really uncomfortable. Things are challenging us every single day, and life is supposed to be a challenge. We are supposed to grow and change with things, so let's try and grow and change and be loving, compassionate people, which is really difficult, but we can do it. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I think part of it is we have a tendency to either idealize the past, idealize right now, or think there's going to be an ideal future. And so, in some sense, we're all responding to that idealism. Either we're now cynics because the past was the ideal, right? Or we're skeptics because we don't know if we can accomplish the ideal right now or ever, right? Or we're idealists because we think we're going to get there someday. And so I think, I guess I would also point you to one of the articles on the handout. It's called The Christian Mandate to Subvert Tribalism. And it's an article out of Christianity Today. And I just want to read you one of the quotes that I think kind of gets a little bit to what you're saying. It says, for Christians who believe in the existence of unchanging objective truth, which I certainly do as a Christian, I believe in objective, unchanging truth, a call for nuance may feel a bit like an invitation to travel down the slippery slope of postmodern relativism. And I definitely feel that sometimes. But, she says, properly conceived, nuance is the loving pursuit of accurate understanding accompanied by an awareness that we know in part and we prophesy in part, 1 Corinthians 13:9, and that we see only a reflection as in a mirror, 1 Corinthians 13:12. Such a pursuit demands levels of patience, humility, discernment, and self-control that black and white approaches to people and issues do not. So I think the challenge is to hold on to, at least for me, to hold on to the objective truth that I believe is spoken so clearly in God's word and through the gospel, and at the same time respond compassionately and with understanding and with humility, realizing that I don't have a perfect grasp, even of the objective truths that I want to hold on to. I don't have a perfect grasp of them, and so then listening well to other people and loving them well. But I feel with you.
I think we have time for one more question. Tim?
Question for Kevin. You said that with exploring technology, we have so many more ways to get information, and in fact, we probably need some filters. Isn't the problem that with our technology, be it Facebook with its algorithms, or talk radio with its far right, not much far left, frankly, but far right, Twitter, cable TV, that the fact is we have plenty of filters, and they tend to be people's political agendas that do polarize us. Isn't it a fact that if we had the technology with none of those filters, we would have more information, and we might be more open to other ideas rather than being put in the silos that we're most comfortable in, or in the echo chambers, or whatever you want to call it, that frankly we are faced with far too many filters.
So the question is that there are filters there, and there are manipulators using those filters. And if we could just get beyond that and just have information, and then we could be our own filters. That's a very difficult thing to change in our society, but at least we should be aware of who's manipulating whom.
So there was a study, I'm trying to think of when and where I read it, about a year ago, that said people under 30 can't tell the difference between legitimate news and fake news. So what changes if you take away the filters? We have to have filters. The question is, how are we developing those filters? Are we developing relationally, people to people? Are we developing them through algorithms? How do we have the filters? And that may be the better question, is how we have them. There's a ton of ways to get information that can buy route all of those. And there are people who know how to buy route them and people who don't. So I don't know that it's a question of, if we get rid of the filters, is there bias in the filters? Yes. How many media companies are there in the US? 5 major media companies that limit stuff, but how many people don't use the major media outlets at all? So there's ways around it. For me, the better question of filter would be is, how are we teaching ourselves, our children, our neighbors, our friends, how to filter, how to process? As a pastor, how do I teach my church members how to filter? You know, what's at the core? I always come back to 2 things. For me, I come back to Jesus when he says, you know, love God with everything you are and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that includes three things: loving God, loving myself, and loving my neighbor. That affects every relationship and how I process all data. The second thing he said is they're gonna know you're my disciples by your love for one another. Not by your ideas, not by your worship service, not by this practice, this doctrine, this way of reading scripture. They're gonna know you're my disciple by your love for one another. That's filters. So how do I pass on to my kids? How do you use the internet and understand if your faith in God is at the core of who you are? How does that become the filter for the information? How does that become the critique to the political stuff? Can I have a dialogue with someone who completely disagrees with me politically and love them? And this isn't that cheap love of, well, I'm being Wisconsin polite, so it's love. I said hello and good morning and shook your hand when we did the passing of peace, so that's love. No, this is that, am I setting myself aside for the other love? Those are filters. And I think that's how we have to deal with the technology. How do we figure out to get people back to the simplest thing of, it's about seeing each other face to face, seeing our potential to bear God's image face to face.
I know there is, but I want to bring this to closure. On the sheet tonight, Luke mentioned one article from Christianity Today. If you look on the sheet, David Blankenhorn, we've given 2 articles by him. He is a professor at NYU of sociology, and he has studied polarization since the election. And he has given in those articles not only the dangers that's occurring, but he has given very practical steps for what to do when we are engaging in a conversation that's getting polarized. It's very practical. And he's also founded an organization called Our Better Angels. And they have been going around the country doing workshops for the last several months. They just were in Minneapolis last week. And they get people to sit down who are identified as strong Republicans and strong Democrats. And they put them in a room and they insist that they listen to each other, not shout at each other, and tell each other's story and what they truly believe. And out of those conversations has come a greater realization of what Kevin is talking about, that when we talk to people one-on-one and really respect them, we learn an awful lot about them, and we also learn that there's a lot that we share with them. So I'd encourage you to take a look at some of these articles. Thank you for your patience tonight. I want to thank the panelists very much, and I hope we will go forward from here. Next week, November 14th, at 4:30 in this room, the students are going to put on a conversation, all student run, about what to do about North Korea. So that will be the next event sponsored by the Center for the Politics and People. We hope you can come.